I used to think winter had a particular sound, not the poetic hush people praise, but the practical silence of a city saving its breath. In our little counting house, that sound was sharper. It was the scratch of Mr. Scrooge's pen, the rustle of ledgers, and the timid crackle of a coal fire that never seemed to trust it had permission to burn. I am Bob Cratchit, clerk by occupation and, if I am honest, a habit of patience by temperament. My place in this story begins on a low stool at a narrow desk, with cold seeping through my sleeves. I do not tell what follows to make myself a saint. I am a husband and a father. I wish for comfort, as any man does. I simply learned that a household can be rich in laughter even when the purse is thin. Tonight, I invite you to step quietly beside me and listen. That year began like every other. Mr. Scrooge sat inside his office with the door half open so he could see me, and so I could remember he was there. I sat outside in the cold, trying to make my ink behave, and my fingers remember their duties. He was not a large man physically, but his presence filled a room in the way a locked window fills a house. The day before Christmas, London seemed to hurry toward warmth. Yet in our office, joy was a suspect commodity. Mr. Scrooge's nephew, Mr. Fred, arrived with a friendliness that made the place look smaller. He offered his hand and his annual invitation with the cheerful persistence of someone who believes love is most necessary where it is least welcomed. Mr. Scrooge received him as he would a bill. "Humbug," my employer said, and the word settled over the room like a lid. What does a clerk do in such moments? We become furniture with ears. I listened, and I admit I judged. The truth is that I had every reason to resent my employer. The hours were long, the pay was meagre, and the cold was a daily lesson in humility. But resentment is a luxury that demands energy, and energy is exactly what a father of a large family must spend carefully. There is a detail I cannot forget. When Mr. Fred spoke of Christmas as a time that softens people, my employer's face did not shift into anger so much as into fatigue. It was as though the very idea of warmth had once wounded him. People do not become stone overnight. After Mr. Fred left, 2 gentlemen came to solicit contributions for the poor. Their manners were impeccable. Mr. Scrooge answered them with the arithmetic of indifference. Were there prisons? Were there workhouses? I lowered my eyes, ashamed in the way one is ashamed for another person's public cruelty, and also afraid. A man unmoved by the poor is not always kind to the modestly employed. You might ask why I did not speak. That is a fair question. But the working man's courage is often quiet. It looks like enduring an unpleasant sentence so your children can eat supper. When evening finally arrived, I gathered my scarf and asked for the next day off. My words were careful and apologetic. Mr. Scrooge granted it with a warning that he expected a full day's work the following morning. I thanked him as though he had given me a treasure. Then I stepped out into the street where London, by comparison, felt kind. On my way home, I passed shop windows glowing with food I could not buy, and toys I could not pretend to need. Desire does not disappear just because you are decent. It simply learns better manners. I thought of my family and of Tiny Tim, my smallest boy, whose body was fragile, but whose spirit had the stubborn gleam of a candle refusing the wind. At home, my wife set about turning modest ingredients into a feast that could still feel ceremonial. If you have never watched someone stretch a few coins into joy, you have missed one of the quiet miracles of the world. We were not blind to our circumstances. We simply refused to let them be the only story in the room. I confess that I spoke of Mr. Scrooge that evening with more restraint than he deserved. My wife was not fond of him, and she was right. Yet even in our irritation we kept a peculiar courtesy. When you are poor, you become an expert in deciding which battles to fight and which to transform into jokes. We smiled at the memory of the cold office and my thin coat. Those jokes mattered. They kept bitterness from setting like cement. That is what Christmas offered us, not extravagance, but a brief permission to dwell in our better selves. But we still wonder whether a man like Mr. Scrooge hates joy because he truly believes it is foolish, or because he fears that the moment he allows it in, he will remember what he has lost. Later that night, I heard nothing of ghosts. I am a practical man. Yet, looking back, I think the first haunting had already begun. It was not in my employer's chambers, but in my own thoughts. The question of what we owe one another had moved into the room like a cold draught. In truth, I did not expect Mr. Scrooge to change. Most of us do not. We build our futures around other people's constants. And if I sound too solemn for a story that ends in laughter, allow me one ordinary confession. I like a day off. I like tea that has time to cool a little before anyone remembers to drink it. I like the way children treat a small gift as if it were the key to the universe. So I went to bed with gratitude for a small mercy, worry for a fragile child, and a faint hope that even the coldest office in London might someday learn the meaning of a fire that does more than warm the hands. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of light that looks fragile but insists on being seen. The city wore a different face. Even the cobblestones seemed to forgive one another for being hard. I rose early, not because my duties required it, but because hope is often an early riser in a poor home. Our rooms were small, yet on that day they felt vast. My wife moved with a brisk grace that I have always admired. She could turn necessity into celebration without pretending we were anyone else. The children, half-dressed and fully excited, rehearsed happiness as though it were a song they meant to sing well. Tiny Tim was the heart of our morning. His crutch tapped softly as he made his way through the bustle. That sound remains in my memory as clearly as any church bell. He was a boy who understood that tenderness is not something you wait for. It is something you practice. We went to church, and I noticed how people greeted one another more readily than on any other day. Perhaps that is the only revolution most of us can manage, a brief uprising of kindness. It costs nothing, and yet demands courage from those who have grown used to indifference. When we returned home, the meal became our ceremony. The goose was not large, but it was ours, and we treated it with the reverence of a royal banquet. My wife had prepared the pudding with that solemn concentration cook's reserve for dishes that will be judged by memory rather than taste. If you have ever waited for a small pudding to be done in a modest kitchen, you know the suspense of it. We breathed in the scent like pilgrims approaching a shrine. One of my daughters declared that no king had ever eaten better. This was not factual, of course, but it was good for the soul. I laughed more that day than I had in weeks. There is a peculiar relief in laughter that does not deny hardship, but refuses to be owned by it. Sometimes that is what survival looks like. Not grand speeches, but a table of children who believe their father is a capable man even when he is counting pennies in his head. We spoke of many things. We spoke of church, of neighbours, of the way winter makes a person grateful for any warm corner. The conversation drifted, as it often does, to Mr. Scrooge. And here I must be honest, because honesty is the only virtue a narrator can truly guarantee. My wife spoke sharply of him. She was not cruel, but she did not adorn her opinion. She saw the coldness of his heart mirrored in the coldness of my workplace, and she resented him with a clarity I sometimes lacked. I did not argue. There are injustices too obvious to debate. Yet I asked for restraint when the children were in earshot. I did not want them to learn that bitterness is an acceptable inheritance. I wanted them to grow into adults who could be firm without becoming hard. Then came the moment that now feels stitched into the fabric of the story itself. We raised a toast to my employer. It was an odd custom, and one that surely would have amused him. The man who paid for our bread was also the man who made it harder for us to buy it. Still, the ritual mattered. I said that, in a practical sense, he was the one who made our modest feast possible. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth. Work can be both a blessing and a burden, and sometimes they come from the same hand. The children accepted the toast with the uncomplicated loyalty of the young. My wife accepted it for my sake, and for a moment we all acted as though generosity might be coaxed into existence by naming it aloud. I remember thinking, with a faint sense of embarrassment, that this was the best of us, not because we were patient, but because we still wished well for someone who had not wished well for us. But we still wonder whether kindness offered to an unkind man is a form of naivete or a form of courage that refuses to surrender the future. In the afternoon, we visited relatives and exchanged small gifts. A scarf here, a sweet there, the kind of modest offerings that become precious because they are chosen with care. My youngest insisted on showing everyone a toy repaired rather than replaced, declaring that it was now better than new. I laughed at that. He might be right. A thing mended with devotion often carries more dignity than a thing bought without thought. On the walk home, the air was crisp, and our breath made brief clouds that vanished quickly, like worries that cannot survive a day of shared warmth. I did not think of Mr. Scrooge as a villain at every moment. That is another truth. Sometimes I thought of him as a man who had slipped into a life so narrow that he could not imagine any other shape for it. If your world is measured solely in profit and loss, human beings begin to look like numbers with coats. That evening, as the children drifted toward sleep, Tiny Tim said something I have never been able to forget. He spoke about hoping that people who saw him at church might remember those less fortunate. He did not say it with self-pity. He said it with the serene confidence of someone who believes the world can be nudged toward mercy. A father hears such words with pride and fear. Pride that a child can be so good. Fear that the world may not deserve him. I sat by the window later, listening to distant singing from the street. Across the city, doors were being opened to friends, to family, to neighbours who might otherwise remain strangers. The season seemed to hold out a hand to all of us, even those who habitually refused to take it. I admit I wondered what Mr. Scrooge was doing at that hour. Perhaps he sat alone with his supper and his ledgers. Perhaps he considered the day an inconvenience successfully endured. It is a cruel thing to imagine a man old and alone, even when that loneliness is partly of his making. I have learned that compassion is not a prize to be given only to the deserving. It is a discipline. In ordinary life, we rarely witness sudden transformations. People change slowly, by inches, by disappointments, by quiet revelations. That is why what followed felt so extraordinary. Still, at the end of that Christmas day, I expected the world to return to its usual shape. I expected my stool in the counting house. I expected the thin fire. I expected to bend my head and keep my hopes small. And yet, somewhere in the dark, a door had begun to open, though I did not hear the hinge. The day after Christmas has a peculiar mood. The city is still wearing yesterday's kindness, but it is already checking to see if it can afford to keep it. For families like mine, that liminal day is gentle and practical. You eat leftovers with gratitude. You fold paper and string. You count what remains and decide it was worth it. I did not expect the extraordinary to spill into that quiet space between celebration and routine. If I had, I might have slept less and listened more for omens in the wind. I knew, of course, the name Marley. Anyone who worked for Mr. Scrooge knew it. The sign above the counting house still carried both names, Scrooge and Marley, as if time itself had been asked to show respect for an old partnership. It was a small mystery of sentiment in a man who had little patience for sentiment elsewhere. Marley had been dead for 7 years. Mr. Scrooge would state that fact with a kind of clinical satisfaction, as though he had personally verified the mathematics of mortality. He once emphasized the point by declaring Marley dead as a doornail, and then, in typical fashion, argued with himself about which nails deserved the distinction. I never met Marley. I arrived too late for that chapter. Yet his absence felt like a presence. That is what an influential life can do. It leaves behind outlines that people still step around. On the evening of Christmas Day, my mind was full of domestic tenderness. Tiny Tim had fallen asleep with a peacefulness that made my heart ache in equal measure. The children were still buzzing about their small pleasures. My wife was already thinking of the next week's expenses, with the calm bravery of someone who does not allow worry to become drama. I remember standing at the door for a moment, listening to the last bits of street noise fade. Somewhere across town, laughter was dissolving into sleep. Somewhere else, a lonely man might have been closing his own door with no one on the other side. It would be dishonest to pretend that I spent much time imagining my employer's private hours. The poor are often too occupied with survival to indulge in psychological portraits of the wealthy. Yet sometimes, curiosity is simply empathy wearing a different coat. I had heard that Mr. Scrooge kept his home as sparely as his heart. I had heard that he had little use for company and less use for comfort. London is an expert in rumour. It manufactures stories the way bakeries manufacture bread, out of need. out of habit, out of the desire to fill a quiet space. And so, in the evening, when a neighbour I trust mentioned that the wind had been strange and the night unsettling, I smiled politely and said, "Winter always plays tricks. We do this often, do we not? We call the unknown a trick so that it will not demand further attention." But the name Marley came up again, more than once, in separate conversations. A grocer spoke of old partners and unfinished reckonings. A woman who had once worked near the counting house said she always felt a chill when she passed our door at night. She claimed the knocker had looked like a face in the fading light, and then she laughed at her own nerves. I said nothing. It is a sensible rule among clerks that you do not feed superstition in public. Yet, in private, I could not help recalling the oddness of that sign above the door, the way it suggested a man might prefer the company of a name to the company of living souls. The next morning, the city seemed to return to work reluctantly. I walked to the counting house with that modest dread familiar to employees everywhere. Even centuries apart, I suspect the feeling is the same. You love your family. You love your rest. You do not always love the person who controls your hours. I arrived early, as I always did. Habit is one of the few virtues that costs nothing. The frost was sharp. My breath came out in thin, impatient clouds. I unlocked the outer door and took my place at my desk, preparing the day's books. The office looked exactly as it always had. That was both a comfort and a disappointment. I had once daydreamed that money might soften a man's manner with age. I had also seen enough to know it often does the opposite. Wealth can become a mirror that reflects only itself. As the morning wore on, I noticed something I could not immediately name. The quiet was different. The air did not feel kinder, but it felt expectant, like a room waiting for a verdict. A messenger stopped by with papers. A tradesman asked after the firm. In each exchange, the same casual question appeared, lightly masked as politeness. How was Mr. Scrooge? Had anyone seen him early? Was he well? I answered cautiously, saying he had not yet arrived. I did not understand why the question carried such weight, but London, when it chooses to be, is a very attentive audience. It was then that I began to suspect that something unusual had happened in the night. Not because of any evidence I had, but because the city's gossip had shifted from holiday chatter to pointed curiosity. In modern terms, I imagine it as the way an office feels when an executive has a sudden, inexplicable meeting on a day no one expected meetings. The emails come faster. The whispers become more polite, and everybody pretends they are not waiting for a headline. I tried to focus on my work. That is what clerks do when they cannot control the story. We control the columns. We count. We add. We make sure the sums are correct even when the world feels uncertain. But we still wonder whether the most profound changes in a person's life begin not with grand speeches or public declarations, but with a private night when the past returns to demand an honest accounting. I was not frightened exactly. I reserve fear for more immediate threats, like illness and empty cupboards. Yet I felt a stir of unease. When a man builds his identity on control, and the city begins to suspect that control has been challenged, even a clerk can sense the tremor. Still, I told myself that whatever had happened to Mr. Scrooge would not involve me. I had my own responsibilities. I had a son whose health required every spare ounce of prayer and practicality. And so I sharpened my pen, straightened the ledgers, and waited for my employer to enter with his usual cold precision, certain that the world would continue as it always had. I did not yet know that the next door to open in this story would not be the office door, but the locked door of a man's conscience. Mr. Scrooge arrived late. That sentence alone would have been enough to make the morning remarkable. He was a man who treated time as a property he owned outright, and he expected the rest of us to pay rent for every minute. When he did not appear at his usual hour, I felt a strange mix of relief and alarm, like a strict schoolmaster missing roll call. The door finally opened, and he stepped in with a quickness that did not match his age. The weather had not warmed, yet he looked as though he carried some private fire. His eyes were bright, and his mouth, which I had known mainly for frowns, seemed unsettled, as if it had forgotten how to be firm. I rose, ready for the customary reprimand. He gave none. Instead, he glanced at me, and in that glance I saw something unfamiliar. Not softness exactly, but attention. It was as though he were seeing me for the first time as a man rather than a piece of office equipment that occasionally ate and shivered. I will not pretend I understood him at once. We peasants of the payroll do not easily trust sudden weather changes in those who have ruled our climate for years. He went into his office and shut the door. The city noise outside seemed to retreat. I tried to work. My pen moved, but my thoughts stalled. In time, he called me in. He asked after my family. The question was simple, almost casual, the kind of thing a neighbour might say while passing a gate. Yet, in that room, it landed like a bell. I answered carefully, naming my wife and my children, and mentioning Tiny Tim with a father's inevitable pride. He listened, not the way a man listens to a report, but the way a man listens to a story he has reason to take seriously. It was only later, in fragments pieced together across that day, that I began to understand what had happened in his chambers the night before. He had been visited by the ghost of Jacob Marley. The idea was so strange that I would have dismissed it as fancy if I had not seen the evidence of disturbance in my employer's demeanour. Marley, I learned, had not come elegantly. He had come burdened. The story, as it reached me, described chains made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, and heavy purses. The image struck me with immediate force. Those were the tools of our trade made into a sentence of regret. It was a punishment shaped precisely like the life that had earned it. What would it mean to be bound forever to the objects you prized above people, to have your identity become your prison? I have known men who carry invisible chains without ever seeing a ghost, the father who works himself into exhaustion because he believes rest is theft, the widow who hoards out of fear that generosity will invite disaster, the young clerk who learns to despise dreamers because he cannot afford to be one. The chains are not always cruel in appearance. Sometimes they look like prudence, but we still wonder whether the worst captivity is the one imposed by others, or the one we assemble quietly, link by link, in the name of being sensible. Marley's warning, as I understood it, was not only about punishment after death. It was about the tragedy of missing life while you are still alive. That is a fear I recognize. A poor man can miss life by being too tired to notice it. A rich man can miss life by believing he has already purchased it. When I returned to my desk, I found myself looking at the ledgers differently. Each figure represented someone's labor, someone's meal, someone's small gamble of hope. Numbers are not cruel, but when we treat them as the only truth, we become cruel. I will confess something slightly ridiculous. At home, when I told my wife that Mr. Scrooge had asked after the children, she stared at me as though I had said the Thames had begun to flow backward. Then she laughed, not unkindly, but with the relief of a woman who has learned that surprise is a necessary spice in a life of careful budgeting. The children, too, reacted with astonishment. One of them asked if Mr. Scrooge had fallen ill. Another asked if he had been replaced by a friendly cousin. We all laughed. It is a simple way to protect ourselves from hope, to wrap it in a joke so that disappointment will not cut as deeply if it returns. That evening, I found myself thinking again of Marley, a man I had never met. Perhaps that is the strange mercy of this tale. The dead entered the story not to terrify us for sport, but to extend a last kindness to the living. As winter deepened, I began to see how my employer's world might have shrunk to a single obsession. He had not built a fortress out of money alone. He had built it out of distrust. The walls were high, but they were also cold. If Marley's chains were forged in life, then perhaps the first act of freedom is to notice the metal before it hardens completely. This is not a lesson only for the wealthy. I have seen working men turn bitterness into a religion and call it realism. The poor can be chained by pride, just as the rich can be chained by greed. Mr. Scrooge had power over others, and with power comes responsibility. That morning in the counting-house, I watched a man begin to reconsider the architecture of his life. I did not know whether the change would last. Habits are stubborn things. Still, I carried a cautious optimism home with me. Like a fragile parcel I was afraid to drop. And perhaps that was Marley's true gift to more than one man. He made the invisible visible, if only for a night, so that a future could be rescued from the weight of the past. The next day, Mr. Scrooge was not entirely the same man, but he was also not entirely a new one. That is how real change often begins. Not with a trumpet, but with a series of small hesitations in the old routine. He did not scold me for the smallest delays. He did not demand that I stretch a single coal into an hour of heat. These are humble signs, I know, but when you have lived under a long winter of temperament, you learn to celebrate the first thaw. By midday, the city had begun to whisper more boldly. A man like Mr. Scrooge cannot shift even an inch without causing a ripple. The man was an institution of austerity. When such an institution wavers, people take notice. I received bits of information the way one receives snowflakes on a coat. A comment from a tradesman, a cautious joke from a messenger, a wide-eyed report from someone who lived near Mr. Scrooge's building. Each fragment carried the same theme. There had been a visitor, not a human one. By the evening of that day, the story of the first spirit had taken shape. The ghost of Christmas past, they said, had led Mr. Scrooge into the corridors of his own memory. opening doors he had kept locked for years. I did not hear the account directly from him. He was not a man given to confession. But the world has a way of delivering truth to the curious, especially in a city dense with staircases, taverns, and honest gossip. I have tried to picture the spirit as it was described. A strange figure, youthful and ancient at once, carrying a light that could be dimmed with a cap. The image is almost tender. It suggests that memory itself is a lamp we can choose to expose or cover. We do it every day in small ways, deciding which versions of ourselves we can bear to meet. The first scene the spirit revealed was of a schoolboy left alone during the holidays, the building empty, the air cold, the silence that teaches a child to believe he is not worth returning for. I do not pretend to know the exact shape of Mr. Scrooge's childhood sorrow, but I understand loneliness. There is a loneliness that comes from being poor in a wealthy city. There is a loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. And there is a loneliness that comes from pride, which is the most stubborn kind. When I imagine him as that boy, I am ashamed of how easy it once was to flatten him into a single word, miser. We see what people do, and we forget to ask what happened to them before they became that way. There was another image, I heard, of a sister who loved him, who called him dear brother, and took him home. Her name was Fan. That detail moved me more than I expected. It is a quiet tragedy that the people who soften us when we are young are not always there when we grow older and harden. I have sometimes looked at my own children and wondered what version of me they will carry into adulthood. Will they remember my jokes at the supper table or my tired silences? Will they remember that I tried? It is a dangerous thing to realize that someone you resent was once someone small. But we still wonder whether we become unkind because life teaches us to be, or because we decide, little by little, that kindness is too risky to afford. The spirit, I was told, also showed him apprenticeship days. A master named Fezziwig. A Christmas party where music and food flowed freely, where a man in a position of authority understood that goodwill is not a leak in profits, but a foundation for loyalty. That scene is a dagger and a balm at once. A dagger because it proves Mr. Scrooge had witnessed generosity up close. A balm because it shows he had not always been beyond reach. I can almost see the contrast. A warm warehouse of laughter in the past, and our cold counting house in the present. Something had been lost between those two rooms. You might think the lesson is simple. Be like Fezziwig, not like Scrooge. But life is rarely a neat moral chart. There are pressures, fears, ambitions that work at a person quietly, like water eroding stone. A man may not notice the changes in himself until he is already someone his younger self would not recognize. I admit, a foolish thought crossed my mind when I heard about Fezziwig. I wondered what I would do if I ever owned a business of my own. The idea is laughable, of course. The nearest I will come to such ownership is deciding which of my children gets the larger slice of bread when the loaf is small. Still, the thought made me smile. We are all permitted harmless fantasies. They keep the heart flexible. That night at home, my wife asked why I seemed preoccupied. I told her I was thinking about how a man might remember his first kindness. She raised an eyebrow and said that if Mr. Scrooge truly wanted to prove he had a heart, He could begin by buying a better coal scuttle for his long-suffering clerk. I laughed and I agreed. Philosophy is important, but so is heat. Even Tiny Tim, when I mentioned that our employer had perhaps been reminded of his youth, said quietly that people are not born hard. He said it with the seriousness of a small person making room for a large idea. Children have a way of speaking like prophets without noticing. As I lay awake, I thought about the ghost's light, that strange beam that reveals what we have been and what we have tried to forget. Memory can be cruel, but it can also be a form of mercy, because it proves we were once capable of feeling differently. In the counting house, I had learned to see Mr. Scrooge as a fixed climate, but listening to these reports of his past, I began to imagine him as weather after all, changeable, vulnerable to forces he did not fully command. That realization did not erase the hardships he had caused my family. It did not turn cold wages into warm ones, but it made the story larger than grievance. The ghost of Christmas past did not visit me. It did not need to. I carry enough of my own history without supernatural assistance. Yet I suspect that if any spirit were to lead me through my earlier days, it would find the same truth it found in Mr. Scrooge. A human heart can be shaped away from goodness, but it can also be shaped back toward it, if the right door is opened at the right time. The following morning, the counting house looked exactly as it always had, and that sameness felt almost suspicious. The ledgers were stacked with their sober authority. The ink still refused to flow unless coaxed by warmth we could not afford. Outside, London shook off the holiday with brisk impatience. Inside, I found myself watching my employer with the alertness one uses for unpredictable weather. By then, the tale of the ghost of Christmas past had begun to circulate in cautious fragments. A private night, once it touches a man like Mr. Scrooge, becomes a public curiosity. I did not hear the story from him. I heard it from the city, and from the subtle shifts in his manner that proved something extraordinary had happened. There was talk of a bright spirit, of childhood scenes, of a sister named Fan, who had once softened him. There was also the beloved memory of Mr. Fezziwig's Christmas party, where a generous employer understood that goodwill is not an expense, but an investment in human dignity. Yet, the part that held the air in a tighter silence was the story of a young woman named Belle. I had never known Mr. Scrooge to speak of romance. Men like him often treat affection as a distraction, or worse, a vulnerability. But the spirit, it seems, had not asked his permission. It had led him to a room where his younger self stood, with a woman who loved him not for his fortune, but for the person he might have become. Belle was said to be gentle and determined. She returned his ring. She told him that another idol had replaced her in his heart, an idol made of gold and guarded by fear. She was not cruel. That is what makes the scene painful. The truth, delivered kindly, can still cut deep. I cannot claim to know what Mr. Scrooge felt while watching that moment again, but I understand how a man can confuse security with happiness. Every father has rehearsed that mistake in his mind at least once. We tell ourselves that if we earn a little more, life will finally calm down. Then we turn around and realize we have been so busy providing that we have forgotten to be present. but we still wonder whether the moment love leaves is a punishment for our priorities, or a mercy that tries to stop us from becoming someone we will one day mourn. As I worked, I found my thoughts straying from arithmetic into sympathy. It is an unusual place for sympathy, the counting house. Yet grief, even vicarious grief, insists on being acknowledged. I pictured Belle's quiet courage, the kind of bravery that walks away from a beloved not because love is gone, but because self-respect must survive. There is a particular sorrow in leaving a person you do not hate. It is easy to depart from a villain. It is far harder to leave a man who is still in some hidden corner, capable of goodness. None of this excused my employer's harshness toward my family. The low wage, the thin fire, the casual disdain. Those were real injuries, and I have no wish to varnish them into moral decoration. Yet the memory of Belle suggested that his miserliness might have grown out of fear as much as greed. A man who loses love to ambition may decide never to risk such loss again, and he may mistake that decision for strength. It is a foolish armor. The heart that refuses dependence also refuses belonging. That evening at home, the subject arose in the most domestic manner imaginable. My wife had been listening to the city's whispers with her usual practical skepticism. When I mentioned Belle's name, she said that a man who loses a good woman often spends the rest of his life trying to prove he never needed her. She said it while stirring supper, and I admired the way wisdom in our house arrives alongside potatoes. One of my children asked whether Belle might have regretted her choice. I answered that leaving is not always certainty. Sometimes it is simply the refusal to live inside a future you can already see will be cold. The conversation had grown too solemn for our small kitchen, so I tried to lighten it. I joked that if I ever began to worship my account book above my family, my wife would drag me back to the table by my scarf. She replied that she would not waste effort dragging. She would simply replace me with a kinder husband constructed out of bread dough. The children laughed until Tiny Tim wheezed with delight. It was a silly moment, but those are the moments that keep a household from hardening. Later, Tiny Tim said quietly that people sometimes chase what they want so fiercely that they forget what they need. He did not say it as judgment. He said it as compassion. In the days before these visitations, I had assumed Mr. Scrooge despised Christmas because he found it irrational. Now I suspected the season might have been painful to him. Festive warmth can be intolerable if it illuminates the warmth you traded away long ago. The ghost of Christmas past, if the reports are true, did not only show him what he had lost, it showed him what he had once been capable of offering. That realization can break a man or begin to rebuild him. For myself, I felt a renewed gratitude for the imperfect abundance of my home. We had little, but we still had one another, and I carried a quiet warning back to my own heart. It is possible to be poor in money and still rich in attention. It is also possible to be rich in money and poor in every other currency that matters. When I closed the counting house that night, I sensed that the story was approaching its next, sharper lesson. The past had been opened. The present was about to be measured. And I, a humble clerk, stood close enough to feel the temperature of a life beginning to turn. If the past is a mirror, The present is a window. That is what I thought as the city moved through those days after Christmas, unaware that my employer was being measured not by his accounts, but by his capacity to witness ordinary human life without flinching. I did not see the ghost of Christmas present. I did not hear its booming laughter or feel the sweep of its green robes. Yet I came to understand its work through the most intimate evidence possible. My own home, my own table, my own family became part of the lesson. The story I later pieced together was astonishing in its simplicity. The spirit led Mr. Scrooge not to palaces, but to modest rooms. Not to grand sermons, but to the everyday courage of people who still bothered to be kind. And so, in an irony that still makes me smile, our little Christmas dinner the day before had not only fed my children. It had become a scene in a moral education for a man who had long believed morality was a frivolous expense. I try to imagine what he saw. He would have entered, in spirit at least, a room warmed by love more than fuel. My wife bustling from pot to plate with that practiced determination that turns poverty into choreography. The older children helping, teasing, offering opinions on seasoning as though our goose were a diplomatic affair. The goose, I should say, was not grand. Dickens would have smiled at how we admired it as though it were the proudest bird in London. We had no need to pretend it was enormous. We had only to savour what it represented. A day set aside to affirm that our worth was not measured by the size of our meal. I had carved the meat with exaggerated solemnity to entertain the children. That is a detail I remember clearly. A father will make a ceremony out of anything if it helps his family feel secure. When the slices were arranged, my wife looked at me with a mixture of amusement and love that made the whole room feel softer. Tiny Tim sat near the fire, careful not to crowd it. His face glowed with that gentle radiance peculiar to children who have endured pain and still choose joy. When he smiled, the room seemed to breathe easier. I cannot imagine what it did to Mr. Scrooge to see my son. Tiny Tim is not a symbol to me. He is my child. He is the boy who insists on blessing the world even when the world has not been particularly gentle with him. Yet, for my employer, I suspect Tim was a question that could no longer be ignored. What kind of society allows a child so bright to be so vulnerable? What kind of man sits in comfort while such a child's fate depends on the whim of wages? The spirit, I learned, did not hide the truth. It showed him Tim's condition. It showed him our tenderness and our worry. It showed him the way my wife's smile sometimes trembled at the edges when she thought no one was looking. I had not meant for our joy to be an argument. It was simply the shape our love took. But we still wonder whether the most persuasive case for compassion is misery displayed openly, or dignity maintained quietly under pressure. There was another detail, and it is almost funny in hindsight. After the meal, we made a toast. We did indeed toast Mr. Scrooge by name in our little room. My wife did so with reluctance. I did so with the complicated politeness of an employee who must keep his gratitude and his frustration in the same pocket. If my employer heard that toast through the ghost's permission, I hope he also heard the subtext. We were not thanking him for generosity. We were acknowledging the fragile thread that connected his choices to our survival. A thread that could be strengthened with mercy or snapped by indifference. We finished with the pudding, small but triumphant. The children applauded the moment it arrived, which is one of those domestic scenes that makes you both laugh and swallow a lump in your throat. My youngest declared it the finest pudding in England. That statement was likely untrue, but it was delivered with such conviction that it deserved respect. I can picture the ghost of Christmas present laughing at a genial laugh that honours the brave illusions of the poor. Afterward, we sang. Not brilliantly, not in perfect harmony, but we sang in the way families sing when the goal is not performance, but belonging. Tiny Tim's voice was thin but determined, like a small lantern in fog. There are evenings when I would trade every coin I have for the chance to preserve that sound forever. A light moment is needed here, or my heart will grow too heavy for a proper narrative. So allow me to confess that our cat attempted to steal a bit of goose with the quiet confidence of a seasoned criminal. My eldest chased her away with mock outrage. The children laughed. My wife pretended to be stern. The cat remained unconvinced by authority. It was an ordinary comedy of a household at ease with itself. Another small joke, because life requires them. One of the children asked if Mr. Scrooge had ever eaten pudding that did not taste like discipline. My wife replied that if he had, it was probably a clerical error. This is how we protected our spirits. Humour is not disrespect. It is breathing room. The ghost, as the story continued, also visited other homes that day. Mr. Fred's cheerful gatherings, the humble celebrations of people who had far less than we did and still managed to share. Mr. Scrooge was shown a living map of goodwill, each small lamp in the city arguing against his belief that warmth was an irrational indulgence. I think this was the genius of the present's lesson. It did not say, "Be ashamed because others suffer." It said, "Be humbled because others still love." For a man like my employer, that might be harder to bear than sorrow. Sorrow is familiar in the world. Joy, in the face of hardship, can feel like a rebuke to the soul that has refused it. When I returned to the counting-house after those days, I watched him with a new attentiveness. He was still reserved, still guarded, but something in him seemed less certain of its old conclusions. A man does not dismantle a lifetime of habits in a single dawn. Yet I sensed that the ghost of Christmas present had done what the past could not complete. It had brought him into a room where love was not an idea, but a pot on the stove. A laugh shared over a small goose. A boy with a crutch who still offered blessings to strangers. If the present can teach that kind of lesson, perhaps it is not merely a slice of time. Perhaps it is a gift, wasted only when we refuse to look at it with honest eyes. There is a moment in every family story when love and fear become indistinguishable. For us, that moment often wore the face of Tiny Tim. After Christmas, the city returned to its usual gait, brisk and uncompromising. The warmth of the holiday did not vanish overnight, but it thinned, like embers after the last log has settled into ash. In our house, we held on to the glow as long as we could, because we knew that winter, in every sense, was not finished with us. Tiny Tim's health was spoken of softly, not because we denied it, but because naming a fear too loudly sometimes makes it feel more powerful. My wife had a practical courage. She measured the household needs with the same steady gaze she used to measure her own anxiety. I learned from her that a mother's endurance is a kind of quiet art. It was during these days that I began to understand the weight of what the ghost of Christmas present had shown my employer. The spirit, I was told, had spoken plainly of my son's fate. It had used words that were both a warning and a test. If things remained as they were, Tiny Tim would not survive. That truth was not new to me. I had lived with it in the most human way possible, by trying not to imagine the empty chair at our table. But for Mr. Scrooge, the truth arrived with a different sting. He had dismissed poverty as a problem solved by prisons and workhouses. He had treated need as a moral failure rather than a social responsibility. Now a single child threatened the stability of his philosophy. I do not say this to turn my son into a weapon. Tim would have hated that. He had a generosity that made even his suffering feel like an opportunity for kindness. He once asked me to carry extra coins to church, so we could give them to someone who looked colder than we did. That kind of goodness is both beautiful and difficult to witness, because it asks the rest of us to rise to its level. On an ordinary evening, as I was helping him settle near the fire, he asked about Mr. Scrooge. The very name in his mouth sounded gentle, stripped of grievance. "Will he ever be happy?" he asked. Children do that. They bypass the adult need for retribution and go straight to the tender question beneath it. I told him that happiness is sometimes a skill we learn late, and sometimes a door we must be brave enough to open ourselves. He nodded, as though this were an important lesson for a boy who had already mastered pain better than most adults. My wife, overhearing, added with a faint smile that if Mr. Scrooge learned to be kind, the coal merchants would lose a very loyal customer. That is one of the small jokes we permitted ourselves. A harmless rebellion of humour against fear. Another light moment followed soon after. One of my daughters said that if the spirits truly wished to frighten Mr. Scrooge, they should have shown him the bill for our pudding ingredients. The children laughed, and even Tim's eyes brightened with mischief. Life, when you are poor, is stitched together by these tiny threads of laughter. Without them, the fabric tears. Yet behind the humour lived a serious truth. Tiny Tim's condition was not only a private sorrow, it was a consequence of a system that asked families like mine to survive on the edge of breath. The ghost of Christmas present, I believe, wanted Mr. Scrooge to see that suffering is not abstract. It has a name. It has a face. It sits in a chair too close to a small fire and still wishes the world well. But we still wonder whether real compassion begins when we see a stranger's pain, or only when that pain becomes connected to our own choices. In my more candid moods, I admit I sometimes resented the moral burden poverty placed on us. We were expected to be grateful, dignified, cheerful, and patient, all while balancing on a thread. The world likes its poor to be inspiring. It is less comfortable with poor people who are angry. I was angry at times, quietly so. Anger that I had to bargain with fate about my child's future. Anger that I had to thank a man for wages that did not keep the cold out of my bones. Anger that kindness could feel like a luxury product reserved for those who already had enough. Yet, in the presence of Tiny Tim, anger softened into resolve. He was not a sermon. He was a living boy who loved his siblings, adored his mother, and trusted the goodness of the world with a faith that bordered on the miraculous. I often think the world underestimates how brave that kind of faith is. When I considered what Mr. Scrooge had likely witnessed, I imagined him standing in our room, unseen, listening to our voices. He would have heard my wife's careful optimism. He would have heard the children's excitement over small things. He would have heard Tim's blessing. God bless us, everyone. It is a simple line, and it contains a universe. It is not a demand. It is a gift offered outward, even to those who have not earned it. I can see why that moment might have unsettled him. If you have built a life around the idea that the world is harsh and must be met with hardness, a single child's blessing can feel like a contradiction too pure to ignore. It was around this time that rumours reached me of another element of the present Spirit's lesson. The Spirit had revealed 2 children hidden beneath its robe, named Ignorance and Want. The names themselves are a condemnation without shouting. The image suggests that society's failures are not distant monsters. They are children, vulnerable and alarming, created by neglect. I heard this and felt a chill deeper than weather. Want I knew intimately. Ignorance I feared, because it is often the companion of indifference. My wife and I spoke of the late one night after the children had fallen asleep. We agreed that we could endure scarcity more easily than we could endure the thought of our children being unseen by the wider world. A society that looks away from its weakest members is not only cruel, it is foolish. In the following days, I noticed my own habits of thought shifting. I had always tried to protect my family with optimism. Now I recognized that optimism should not be used to excuse injustice. It should be used to fuel the work of making life kinder. That is, perhaps, another secret lesson of this story. The poor do not need pity alone. We need structure, fairness, and wages that do not demand heroism from ordinary people. I do not know whether Mr. Scrooge grasped the full scope of these implications in one night, but I suspect the ghost of Christmas Present had succeeded in the most essential task. It had made him feel responsible for the human cost of his indifference. I returned to the counting-house with that thought turning quietly inside me. If a man as hardened as Mr. Scrooge could be made to see my son not as an inconvenience of the poor, but as a life worthy of protection, then perhaps the world had more room for change than I dared to believe. For Tiny Tim's sake, I needed to believe that. I learned long ago that joy can be a kind of courage. It is easy to be cheerful when the cupboard is full and the future feels obedient. It is harder when you are counting coins and counting days. Yet the ghost of Christmas Present, by all accounts, took Mr. Scrooge through rooms where people practiced joy like a duty, not a luxury. The Spirit showed him my employer's nephew, Mr. Fred, in the middle of a gathering that my own modest imagination can only partly furnish. There was food, laughter, teasing, and that particular warmth that comes from people who have chosen to like one another even when life gives them reasons to be guarded. I had met Mr. Fred only briefly, yet his kindness had a memorable weight. He was not blind to his uncle's hardness, but he was stubbornly loyal to the possibility that a man could be more than his worst habit. When I heard that the Spirit had brought Mr. Scrooge to watch the party, I felt a strange sympathy for my employer. There is a special discomfort in being a silent guest at a celebration you have spent years mocking. The laughter must have sounded to him like a language he once knew and deliberately forgot. Fred, as I later learned, raised his glass and spoke of his uncle with affection rather than ridicule. He said that his uncle's gloom would not steal their enjoyment. The room agreed, and then they turned the matter into a game. They imitated Mr. Scrooge's voice. They repeated his humbug with theatrical solemnity. They let his scowl become a harmless performance. It was affectionate mockery, the kind that says, "We will not allow your darkness to dominate our light." I confess that I laughed when I heard this, not because I enjoyed disrespect, but because there was something soothing about the idea that my employer's severity could be reduced for one evening to a joke shared among friends. My wife, when I recounted the rumour, said that if laughter were a currency, Mr. Fred must have been the richest man in London. Then she added that if Mr. Scrooge ever wished to invest in such wealth, she would be happy to sell him a share at an interest rate of basic decency. That made the children roar. One of them suggested we send Mr. Scrooge a formal prospectus for the business of kindness. Another said we should include a sample pudding. It was nonsense, of course, but it was the sort of nonsense that saves a household from despair. The spirit also showed Mr. Scrooge other celebrations in places far humbler than Mr. Fred's home. Miners singing deep underground, sailors sharing a song on a distant sea, families gathered in cramped rooms, making a feast out of whatever their hands could manage. The scale of these scenes mattered. They implied that the season was not a privilege of the comfortable, but a human instinct that survived in every condition. But we still wonder whether the world would look kinder every day if we treated joy not as a reward for good fortune, but as a communal promise we owe one another. As I considered these reports, I recognized something about my own assumptions. I had always believed that the wealthy were insulated from loneliness. The ghost of Christmas present seemed to argue the opposite. Wealth might buy silence, but it cannot buy the easy intimacy of a room where people forgive one another's awkwardness. Our Christmas dinner had been modest, but we had been unashamed of our closeness. We did not need to perform affection. We lived inside it. I remembered, too, a winter from my early marriage when we had no goose at all. Only a small chicken and a loaf that seemed to shrink the moment we set it down. We invented a ceremony anyway. I carved with great seriousness, my wife applauded with mock grandeur, and the children treated the meal as if we had hosted a duke. The memory makes me smile because it proves something humble and stubborn. Joy is not always the result of abundance. Sometimes it is the refusal to let scarcity write the ending. In the counting house, Mr. Scrooge rarely spoke beyond necessity. Yet after these visitations, I noticed him pause, as though listening to something beyond the walls. Once, a group of carolers passed outside. He did not shout at them. He simply stood still, as if deciding whether the sound was an irritation or a doorway. I do not want to exaggerate. He had not yet become the smiling benefactor of later chapters. But the old certainty in his posture appeared less absolute. The present had shown him living proof that community existed without his permission. There is a subtle humiliation in realizing the world can be happy without you. It is also an invitation. It says, you may join when you are ready. Yet there was still the darker side of the present's lesson. The spirit's revelation of ignorance and want suggested that joy alone cannot repair a society. Goodwill must be accompanied by responsibility. Otherwise, the cheerful rooms become islands surrounded by a sea of preventable suffering. I thought of those two spectral children and felt my own resolve stiffen. I did not want my children to inherit a world that asked them to be inspiring while refusing them fairness. The lucky irony of this story is that my employer was being taught precisely what I had long wished he would learn. The poor are not a problem to be managed. We are neighbours, workers, parents and children. We are part of the same ledger of humanity. When the day ended and the shadows lengthened across the office, I sensed the narrative leaning toward its most severe confrontation. The past had cracked his defences. The present had placed him among the living. The future would ask him to look at himself without any comforting disguise. I left the counting house that evening with my scarf tight against the cold, and my thoughts unusually warm. If the spirits could accomplish what reason and resentment had not, perhaps the season was indeed what Mr. Fred claimed. Not nonsense, but a kind of moral oxygen. Winter has a way of narrowing our imagination. The cold persuades us that survival is the only story worth telling. Yet the ghost of Christmas yet to come, as the city began to call it in trembling whispers, did not come to discuss survival. It came to discuss meaning. I did not see this spirit, but I felt the shadow of its passage in the strange quiet that settled over my employer after the second visitation. The first two spirits had been noisy in their effects, like a storm that rattles every window. The third seemed to arrive like snowfall at midnight. You wake and find the world altered without having heard a sound. By the time I reached the counting house that morning, I had already heard the rumour that this final spirit did not speak. It only pointed. Perhaps that was the cruelest mercy of all. When words fail, we cannot argue with them. Mr. Scrooge looked tired in a different way. He was not tired of work. He had always been fueled by work. He looked tired of himself. That is an exhaustion that cannot be cured by sleep. The story, as it reached me later, began in places that had nothing to do with my family. That mattered. A man like Mr. Scrooge might assume that his actions only echo in the small radius of his business. The spirit appears to have shown him that the world is a web of consequences, and that even a solitary life casts a long shadow. He was shown a group of businessmen discussing the death of someone they barely respected. Their conversation was casual, almost amused. They wondered whether the funeral would be well attended. They treated the news as a minor interruption to their schedules. That image strikes me with uncomfortable familiarity. The powerful often speak of mortality with a calm that borders on arrogance. The poor, by contrast, see death up close and cannot afford to pretend it is abstract. I heard that he was also shown thieves trading stolen goods taken from a dead man's home. Curtains, silver, even clothing. They joked about how little dignity remains when a person has died unloved. There is a brutality in that scene that does not require gore. It is social violence, the violence of indifference, the violence of a life so isolated that even decency feels optional at its end. We have all seen milder versions of it. The way people lower their grief to a polite whisper when they never quite like the person who is gone. The way an office rearranges desks before the chair has cooled. But we still wonder whether the fear of being forgotten is what drives us toward kindness, or whether kindness is meant to be practiced even when remembrance is not guaranteed. It was only after these scenes, I believe, that the Spirit drew him toward what mattered most for our part of the story. He was brought closer to the lives he had treated as peripheral. He was brought closer to the cost of his choices. I imagine him watching our neighborhood from a distance that felt like judgment. The thought of my employer witnessing the future of my family fills me with a peculiar mixture of discomfort and hope. Discomfort because I do not like being studied like an exhibit. Hope because sometimes people only change when a truth refuses to stay private. I learned that the Spirit had shown him a Cratchit household altered by loss, a family trying to be brave in a room that had lost one of its gentlest lights, my wife doing what she always did, keeping the household upright through willpower and love, the children quieter than their years deserved, and Tiny Tim's chair empty. I do not write that with theatrical flourish. A father cannot decorate such a sentence. The absence of a child is a silence that swallows language whole. The Spirit, I was told, let him see me walking more slowly, speaking more softly, trying to be a father to the remaining children while carrying a grief that never quite folds away. It showed him my wife holding Tim's crutch, not as a relic, but as a stubborn refusal to let memory be erased. I do not know if those details were exactly as the Spirit presented them, but the central truth is clear. The future of the poor is not an abstract statistic. It is a face that might vanish if no one intervenes. This was the moment when my employer's earlier comments about workhouses and prisons likely returned to him like bitter echoes. He had dismissed suffering as inevitable. Now the Spirit presented it as preventable. At home, when I later spoke with my wife about these rumors, she listened with a softened skepticism. She said that if ghosts were truly visiting Mr. Scrooge, she hoped they had brought a calculator for his conscience. One of my children, hearing us, asked if a spirit could also visit the butcher and convince him to lower prices. I replied that if the supernatural wished to be fully useful, that would be an excellent place to begin. The children laughed. I laughed too, because parents must sometimes laugh so the house does not drown. Yet beneath the humour, our fear remained ordinary and real. Tiny Tim's health had not improved simply because a wealthy man might be frightened into empathy. We still lived at the edge of uncertainty. In the counting house, I watched Mr. Scrooge with new eyes. I believe the ghost of Christmas yet to come did something more severe than show him death. It showed him the moral emptiness of a life that ends without having loved anyone well. A lonely death is not always a tragedy. Some people prefer solitude and remain kind. The tragedy is a lonely death accompanied by relief from others. That is a harsher verdict. What fascinates me, and what I suspect Dickens intended, is that the Spirit did not demand an impossible transformation. It did not ask Mr. Scrooge to become young again, or to recover lost love, or to undo time. It asked him to change the next choice, the next wage, the next act of attention. That is the kind of change even a stubborn man might accept. As the day ended, Mr. Scrooge seemed to move as if he had been carrying a heavy object for years, and had finally realized he could set it down. He was still frightened, yes, but fear can be fertile ground when it is aimed toward repair rather than retreat. I went home that evening with the image of my son's empty chair haunting me in a different way. Not as destiny, but as warning. The future is not fixed. It is negotiated daily by the choices of those who have power and those who keep insisting that power must answer to human need. If my employer had truly seen what was coming, then perhaps, by some strange mercy of the season, my family stood at the edge of a different tomorrow. The morning after that invisible night of pointing fingers and silent warnings, I arrived at the counting house, expecting the usual hardness of routine. I expected the city to settle back into its familiar indifference. What I did not expect was the uneasy kindness of a man who had spent years treating kindness as a dangerous leak in the roof of profit. Mr. Scrooge greeted me, not with warmth that would have felt theatrical, but with something so simple that it startled me more than a speech would have. A nod, a clear look, a presence that did not immediately search for reasons to disapprove. For a clerk, such changes are like hearing your name spoken gently after years of it being barked. He asked me to step inside his office again. I went, honestly unsure whether I was walking into generosity or a new form of mischief. When a man has been consistent in severity, his sudden softness can feel like a prank on the nervous system. He asked me to sit. I did not sit. I know this may sound absurd, but my body could not quite accept the invitation. I hovered in that polite half-stance of a man who is weathering an unexpected season. He watched me with an odd mixture of irritation and humour, then said something that, if I had not heard it myself, I might have dismissed as impossible. He told me my salary would be raised. I felt the air change. The room did not grow physically warmer, but my chest did. He spoke briskly, as if he feared that tenderness might escape if he let it linger. He said he intended to assist my struggling family. He said he would discuss matters with me at length. And then he added the most astonishing practical detail of all. He told me to put more coal on the fire. That was the line that nearly undid me. A raise is life-changing. Coal is immediate. Coal is the difference between your fingers functioning and your ink freezing into stubborn silence. Coal is the sign that a man has decided you are not a machine. I thanked him too many times. My voice did what voices do when a person tries to sound composed while feeling the world tilt in a kinder direction. When I returned to my desk, I struggled to keep my hand steady. I do not claim that I instantly forgave the years of cold. Forgiveness is not a switch. It is a road. But I felt something close to relief. The kind that makes you realize how tightly you have been bracing yourself without even noticing. Outside the office, the city continued its gossip, now with a different tone. People asked if it was true that Mr. Scrooge had been seen smiling at a boy in the street. They wondered whether he had donated a large sum to charity. They traded their speculation with the delighted caution of people hearing that a storm has decided to become a sunny day. I could neither confirm nor deny. Not yet. I had the privilege of being close to the transformation, but also the duty of being discreet. There is a curious aspect to resisting poverty after you have lived with it a long time. Even good news can feel uncomfortable at first. I found myself thinking of my wife's face when I would tell her. I imagined her cautious joy, the way she would test the reality of improvement like someone stepping onto new ice. I also thought of Tiny Tim. I have prayed for my son with the steady stubbornness of a father who cannot afford to be poetic about mortality. But that day, hope became more than a prayer. It became a plan. But we still wonder whether hope is most powerful when it arrives as a miracle, or when it arrives as a man choosing to do the next right thing. I walked home with a kind of lightness that felt almost improper, as if the world might object to a poor man carrying comfort so visibly. On the way, I stopped at a shop window and considered, for the first time in months, buying something that was not absolutely essential. I did not buy it. Old habits of caution do not vanish in a single day. But the possibility itself was a gift. When I told my wife, she reacted exactly as I knew she would. First with disbelief, then with tears she tried to hide behind brisk efficiency. Then with a laughter that sounded like a kettle finally allowed to boil. She asked if I was certain I had not misheard. I assured her that even if I had misheard, the coal on my coat was physical evidence. She said with that practical humour that has always anchored our household, that if Mr. Scrooge continued behaving like a decent human, she might have to revise her opinion of the entire class of wealthy men. Then she added that she would do so reluctantly, for fear of tempting fate. The children reacted with a bewildered joy. One of them asked if this meant we could have 2 geese next Christmas. Another asked if Mr. Scrooge might now be persuaded to take up singing. I replied that some miracles are best requested gradually. Tiny Tim listened quietly, absorbent as a small sponge catching every hopeful drop. He smiled, then asked in the gentlest voice imaginable whether we should send Mr. Scrooge a thank you note. This is the kind of moment that can make a father look away under the excuse of tending the fire. The next days confirmed what the first had promised. Mr. Scrooge's change did not evaporate with his fear. It deepened into habit. He spoke more kindly to me. He treated my colleagues and acquaintances in the street with a new attentiveness. He seemed almost surprised by how much energy generosity returns to the giver. News spread that he had indeed given a large donation to the charitable gentleman who had visited him previously. People said he had done it with a sincerity that looked almost shy. I thought of the scenes the final spirit had shown him, the businessmen's indifference, the stolen goods, the lonely grave, the horror of being reduced to a news item with no grief attached. Perhaps that was the turning of the key. A man does not need to be loved by everyone, but most men, when they allow themselves to be honest, wish to be mourned by someone. In our small neighbourhood, Mr. Scrooge's new behaviour arrived like an unexpected guest at a modest party. People were tentative at first, then they warmed. A baker offered him a greeting rather than a transaction. A child waved without fear. The city, which excels at cynicism, also excels at recognizing when something rare has occurred. I noticed, too, a change in myself. I had grown used to measuring life by what we could endure. Now I had to learn the gentler skill of measuring life by what we might be allowed to enjoy. That is not as easy as it sounds. When you have trained your heart for survival, comfort can feel like an unfamiliar language. One evening, my wife and I found ourselves laughing over something utterly ordinary, a small disagreement about how much sugar could be spared for tea. We laughed because the argument no longer carried panic underneath it. We laughed because the future had loosened its grip on our throats. This is the sort of domestic comedy that never makes it into history books, yet it is where many lives are truly lived. In the counting house, the fire burned more steadily. I wore a warmer coat. My fingers moved with less pain. My mind felt less crowded by dread. I do not know what Mr. Scrooge thought of these changes in me, but I suspect he began to see what compassion looks like, not as an idea, but as a measurable improvement in another person's daily life. If there is a moral to this chapter of my witness, it is not that ghosts are necessary for goodness, it is that consequences are. The future can be a stern teacher, but it is also an invitation to rewrite the sentence before it is delivered. And so, as the city moved onward, I watched a man once famous for his chill begin to choose warmth, not as a seasonal performance, but as a way of living. The first proof of a changed heart is rarely philosophical. It is practical, almost embarrassingly so. A man does not become kinder in the abstract. He becomes kinder in the way he speaks to the boy on the street, the way he opens his purse for someone he once dismissed, the way he notices that another human being might be cold. That is how I began to trust what was happening. The morning after Mr. Scrooge raised my salary, a large bird entered our story. I say that as if it were a fable, but it was a turkey, and not a modest one. It arrived at our door with a message that was short, clear, and unsettling in its generosity. The bird was for us, with Mr. Scrooge's compliments and with instructions that it be delivered quickly, as though kindness might spoil if it lingered too long in the air. My wife stared at it as if it might begin to talk. I stood there with the kind of stunned gratitude that is half joy and half suspicion. When you have lived a long time with careful portions, abundance can feel rude at first, as though it has arrived without proper introduction. The children treated the turkey as an event. One of them measured it with wide eyes and declared that it was large enough to require civic planning. Another insisted that we should name it before cooking, a suggestion my wife rejected with practical firmness. Tiny Tim, with the gentleness that always disarmed me, said we should thank Mr. Scrooge for thinking of others while still learning how to be joyful himself. He said it as though generosity were a skill one could practice the way a child practices handwriting. I laughed, because the thought of my employer practicing joy like a new craft was both amusing and oddly moving. We prepared the turkey with the seriousness of a household that understands how quickly fortune can change and wants to honor the moment while it is here. My wife instructed the children like a small general overseeing a glorious campaign. The kitchen smelled of herbs, warmth, and disbelief. I do not want to romanticize the scene. We were still a poor family with a fragile child. But for that day, our poverty was not the only headline. But we still wonder whether the greatest gifts are the ones that fill the table, or the ones that persuade a frightened heart that the future might be negotiable. News of Mr. Scrooge's behaviour spread faster than the aroma of our supper. People spoke of how he had approached the two gentlemen, who had earlier solicited donations and offered a contribution so generous that it made them stammer. He did not deliver it with a theatrical flourish. He delivered it with urgency, as if he were racing a clock only he could see. I heard he laughed afterward, a real laugh, not a scoff, not a dismissive grunt, but the sound of a man startled by the pleasure of doing right. That detail matters. People can perform kindness out of guilt. The deeper transformation is when kindness becomes a source of honest delight. The city is suspicious by instinct, but it is also hungry for redemption stories. We like evidence that the world is not fixed in its worst patterns. So London began to watch him as if he were a stage play that might either collapse or become brilliant. I watched him too. In the counting house, he moved with a new restlessness. He asked me questions about my work that suggested he had begun to see the business not as a machine, but as a place where people existed. When I made a small error in a column, I waited for the old storm. He corrected me briskly and then said, with an expression almost embarrassed by its own softness, that mistakes are part of learning. I walked back to my desk as though I had been handed an unfamiliar instrument and told it was safe to use. At home, the children began to build a private mythology around him. This is something children do when reality becomes too strange. One child insisted that the ghosts must have been especially persuasive. Another said that perhaps Mr. Scrooge had discovered that regular meals and humane temperatures were actually enjoyable. Tiny Tim suggested that he might simply have remembered who he was before the world frightened him into caution. My wife, listening, said that if Mr. Scrooge had truly mastered generosity, he might next consider the radical idea of paying his clerk enough to buy candles without negotiation. I teased her that she was becoming fond of him. She replied that she was becoming fond of the idea of stability, and that the difference mattered. We laughed together, because domestic laughter is often a way of admitting that we are afraid to believe in good news too fully. In those days, I also learned that Mr. Scrooge had promised to visit my nephew's home for dinner. Mr. Fred had extended the invitation every year, as if persistence were a form of affection. That courage deserves admiration. It is not easy to keep a seat open for someone who keeps rejecting it. When I heard that my employer had accepted, I felt something like wonder. A man can give money without surrendering any inner ground. Accepting companionship is a more difficult surrender. I imagined Mr. Scrooge standing at Mr. Fred's door with that awkward sincerity many men feel when they are stepping into a room of warmth after years of self-imposed winter. I imagined the laughter, the games, the gentle teasing. I imagined Mr. Fred welcoming him not as a trophy of moral victory, but as family. The thought soothed something in me. The change was becoming social, not just transactional. One evening, I passed a small group of children singing in the street. Mr. Scrooge was nearby. The old version of himself would have glanced away, or scowled, or retreated into his coat, like a turtle into its shell. This time he listened. He did not clap. He did not turn it into a dramatic performance of generosity. He simply stood there and let the sound reach him, as if learning how to receive joy were as important as learning how to give it. If you wish to know what made me begin to truly forgive him, it was that. You can buy a turkey, you cannot easily buy the humility of listening. The improvements in our household were immediate in quiet, consequential ways. Better food, a warmer room, a doctor consulted with less dread in my stomach. Tiny Tim seemed to carry his hope less like a burden, and more like a natural part of his breath. I am not foolish. I know that kindness cannot cure every illness, but it can change the conditions in which illness must be endured. In that sense, generosity is not sentimental, it is structural. I found myself thinking of the future spirit's lesson, the businessman's indifferent chatter, the stolen sheets and curtains, the lonely grave. These had not been merely threats to frighten a stubborn old man. They had been an argument for connection. A life that touches others will be remembered differently than a life that uses others. When the week ended, Mr. Scrooge asked me again about my family, this time with a forthrightness that would have once felt impossible. He inquired whether Tiny Tim was improving. I answered carefully, not wanting to place too much emotional weight on a man still learning to stand in his better self. He nodded, as if receiving a responsibility rather than a compliment. At home we sat down to the turkey meal that now felt like a symbol neither of charity nor of luck, but of change made tangible. The children ate with the reverent enthusiasm of people who suspect they are living inside an important memory. Tiny Tim raised his cup of water, solemn as a small prince, and said that he hoped Mr. Scrooge would be blessed with friends who would never stop inviting him to joy. My wife looked at me with an expression that said, "Our son still wants the world to be good, even after the world has tested him." If this story has taught me anything as a man and father, it is that such faith is rare, and it deserves protection. So I returned to my work, to my warmed hands, to my altered expectations, carrying an emotion that was almost new to me, not only gratitude, but cautious trust. A new year does not arrive with fanfare for families like mine. It comes quietly, like a careful knock at the door. The bills do not pause out of respect for a calendar. The cold does not soften simply because the city has decided to begin counting time again. Yet that year, the turn of the season felt different, because Mr. Scrooge's change had not faded with the disappearance of Christmas decorations. In the weeks that followed, he behaved not like a man performing a holiday vow, but like a man trying to rebuild muscle he had never used. He asked me to bring my family to his attention in practical ways. He inquired about Tiny Tim's needs as though the matter were now part of his honest responsibility. He spoke of doctors and remedies with the directness of someone who understood that compassion, if it is to be more than sentiment, must enter the realm of action. There is an important detail I cannot ignore, because it belongs to the heart of Dickens's story. My employer became, in his own words, a second father to my boy. I do not take that line lightly. It would be easy to repeat it as a slogan. It is harder to describe what it meant in the ordinary rhythm of our days. It meant that when Tim struggled, we did not face the struggle alone. It meant that my wife no longer had to hide her anxieties behind brisk household efficiency. It meant that the other children began to breathe with less tension, as though the air itself had grown less strictly rationed. I had loved my family fiercely before this change, but love, when paired with helplessness, can make a man feel like a candle burning in a draught. I was not ashamed of my poverty. I was ashamed of the moments I could not protect my son from suffering that seemed unfairly preventable. Mr. Scrooge, by altering the conditions of our life, altered my sense of myself. I was still a clerk, still a man who counted coins, but I no longer felt that dignity was something I had to defend alone against the weather and the world. But we still wonder whether redemption is most convincing when it is dramatic, or when it is proven slowly through the patient repetition of better choices. The city began to adjust its image of him in stages. London does not surrender its cynicism quickly. Some insisted it was a temporary softness. Others argued that age had finally loosened his grip on fear. A few, more sentimental than most, said the spirits had opened a door that had been waiting to be found for years. I did not care which explanation the city preferred. I cared about the evidence. I saw him in the street offering a greeting that did not sound like a transaction. I saw him listening more than dismissing. I saw him pause when a child spoke to him, not as though children were an inconvenience, but as though they were citizens of a world he had chosen to rejoin. I also noticed how his laughter began to arrive in small, unexpected bursts. It was not polished. It was not confident. It had the rawness of a man who has rediscovered an old instrument and is surprised that it still makes music. At home, this became a well-loved subject of gentle teasing. One of my daughters asked whether Mr. Scrooge might now be persuaded to attempt a holiday dance. My wife replied that the city might not survive such a spectacle, and that we should introduce joy to him in reasonable doses. Another child offered a mischievous theory that the spirits had not frightened him at all. They had simply shown him what it costs to heat a small office with a stingy coal policy, and he had realized that cruelty was inefficient. I told them that moral awakening can be both lofty and practical. The heart and the budget sometimes agree more often than we admit. Tiny Tim, sitting near a healthier fire, said quietly that he hoped Mr. Scrooge would never stop learning how to be happy, because happiness shared is also a kind of charity. That sentence might sound too polished for a child, but Tim had always carried a startling clarity about human goodness. He spoke with the serenity of someone who had reason to value every ordinary morning. The deeper transformation was not limited to my family. Mr. Scrooge began to be present for his nephew. This was the kind of change that cannot be measured in coins. A man can be generous with money and still remain emotionally sealed. But my employer had accepted the ongoing invitation to dinner. He appeared at gatherings with a stiff humility that gradually softened into genuine comfort. I heard from Mr. Fred that the first visits were awkward in the sweetest way. Mr. Scrooge would sit as though his chair were borrowed, and his welcome might expire at any moment. He would listen silently to jokes aimed at his old humbug, and then, after a pause long enough to make the room uncertain, he would offer a dry remark that made everyone laugh. A family, like a city, learns to forgive when the person returning shows that he understands the cost of what he once refused. I often thought of Belle during this time, the woman he lost, the life he did not choose. The past cannot be rewritten. Yet a man can decide that the future will not repeat the same abandonment in new forms. Perhaps that was part of his quiet penance. In the counting house, our work became less a sentence and more a shared routine. He was still disciplined. He did not become foolish with the firm's funds. Dickens never suggests that generosity requires incompetence. But he did begin to understand that the health of a business is not only a matter of profit. It is also a matter of how human beings are treated while producing that profit. A warmer office does not ruin a company. A fair wage does not collapse the economy of a small enterprise. The cost of decency is often less than the cost of cynicism. I do not mean to present this as a fairy tale in which all problems dissolve. Our household still faced illness, uncertainty, and the ordinary strains of working life. There were evenings when my wife and I argued over small expenses, and mornings when the children were too restless for my patience. Yet those arguments had changed in tone. We no longer argued from panic. We argued from the ordinary friction of a family that now believed tomorrow might hold more than fear. One evening, I caught myself doing something delightfully ridiculous. I was calculating the weekly budget, and I smiled at the numbers. I smiled because they no longer looked like an enemy. They looked like tools. My wife saw me and asked whether I had finally lost my mind. I told her that I was simply enjoying the novelty of arithmetic that did not feel like a threat. She shook her head and said that if Mr. Scrooge's conversion had turned her husband into a romantic about ledgers, then the spirits truly had performed a miracle beyond measure. We laughed until the children joined us, and for a moment the house sounded like a place where worry had been invited to wait outside. I think this part of the story matters because it shows that repair is not a single act. It is a pattern. Mr. Scrooge's generosity had begun with a shocking mourning and an urgent desire to undo a terrible future, but it matured into something calmer. He had started to live as though people were not obstacles to his safety, but the very structure of a life worth keeping. In such seasons, even a poor man begins to believe that the city can change one heart at a time. And as I watched my son grow stronger, I allowed myself the cautious pleasure of imagining that this was not only a Christmas story, but a human one. By the time the next Christmas approached, I had grown accustomed to something I had once believed belonged only to better-off men. I had grown accustomed to planning without dread. Do not misunderstand me. The world did not suddenly become soft. London still had its sharp corners. Work still required stamina. Illness still arrived without invitation. But the shape of our days had changed enough that I could breathe inside them instead of merely surviving them. Mr. Scrooge had not relapsed into his former self. If anything, he seemed determined to prove to his own conscience that the transformation was not a seasonal costume. He arrived early, not to watch me like a hawk, but to begin the day with an energy that looked almost boyish. He asked me about my family with the familiarity of a man who had decided that true wealth is measured in relationships he once refused to price. He did not become sentimental in public. That was never his nature, but he became reliably decent, and reliability is one of the most underrated forms of love. The city had adjusted its gaze. When people met him in the street, they no longer did so with the cautious fear reserved for a known curmudgeon. They greeted him with that restrained British warmth that signals a hard-won truce. Shopkeepers smiled rather than braced. Children waved rather than darted away. Even the charitable gentleman he had once dismissed now spoke of him as a man whose repentance had matured into habit. I listened to these reports with a quiet, almost protective pride. It is strange to feel protective of someone who once made your life more difficult. But redemption, when it is sincere, invites us to participate in it. It asks the community to become the soil in which change can keep growing. Tiny Tim, for his part, was developing in the most miraculous way of all. He was growing. His steps were still careful, and there were days when his health demanded a tenderness in our schedule. Yet his laughter had gained strength. His face had gained colour. The doctor's visits, which had once felt like negotiations with fate, began to feel more like a steady strategy for a future we could cautiously imagine. Mr. Scrooge took a particular interest in this progress. He would ask after Tim's condition without turning the question into charity, performed for applause. He would send small practical help, not always money, but comfort, a warmer blanket, a recommendation of a physician, a book that caught Tim's attention and made him speak for 10 minutes straight about the adventures of people who did not know they were in a moral parable. One afternoon, Tim insisted on reading aloud a passage so enthusiastically that he lost his place twice and laughed at himself both times. My wife teased him that if he grew any more animated, the book would demand hazard pay. Mr. Scrooge, present for the visit, made a dry remark that the book could file its complaint with his office during business hours. Tim laughed so hard he had to catch his breath. It was a small scene, but it belonged to the kind of quiet healing that stories are sometimes too grand to record. But we still wonder whether the true sign of a transformed heart is the grand gesture that turns heads, or the small, steady acts that quietly rebuild trust day after day. At the counting house, I found that my own relationship with work had changed. I no longer felt that I was trading my health for my children's supper. I still worked hard, but I worked with the dignity of a man who knew his labour was respected. One morning, I arrived a few minutes late due to a minor household crisis involving a kettle, a distracted child, and a heroic but misguided attempt to help. I entered the office prepared to apologize with the full gravity of a guilty employee. Mr. Scrooge looked up and asked, with a seriousness that contained a hint of mischief, whether I had been detained by an international emergency. I blinked. He then offered a small smile and said that if the emergency involved breakfast, he would accept it as valid. He told me to sit and begin the day, and he added in a tone so ordinary it felt revolutionary, that family should not be punished for the crime of being alive. I walked to my desk with a gratitude too large for my coat pocket. At home, my wife noticed the change in me too. She said I smiled more easily. I admitted that it was difficult to remain rigid when the household had begun to relax into a future that did not feel hostile. She then reminded me, in the practical language of married life, that if the future was indeed kinder, I could learn to repair the loose hinge on our kitchen door. I promised I would. I did not do it that day. She forgave me with the grace of a woman who understands that moral transformations in men often need to be accompanied by repeated reminders about carpentry. The children continued to treat Mr. Scrooge as a sort of reformed legend. One of them suggested that we should commission a small portrait of him titled "The Man Who Learned to Enjoy Coal." Another argued that the title should be "The Tyrant-Turned-Turkey Distributor." My wife said we could settle the matter by asking Mr. Scrooge what he preferred, and then doing the opposite. even Mr. Scrooge, hearing these reports second-hand, seemed amused rather than offended. Humour, once an enemy to him, had become a sign that he was safe to tease. I occasionally thought of that final spirit's silent hand, the grave, the indifference of those businessmen, the empty Cratchit chair that might have been my destiny. The memory was still painful, but it had changed its function. It was no longer a threat. It was a reminder of how narrow the margin between tragedy and relief can be. In the broader neighbourhood, the effect of Mr. Scrooge's change rippled outward in subtle ways. People spoke more openly about wages and fairness. A few other businessmen, shamed or inspired, began to soften their own policies. It is surprising how often kindness becomes contagious, once someone proves it can exist without ruining the ledger. We were not suddenly living in a utopia, but the social temperature had shifted by a few degrees, and sometimes that is enough to save a life. Mr. Fred remained a steady presence too. He treated his uncle's change not as a victory to parade, but as a relationship to nurture. He invited him frequently. He allowed him to be awkward. He forgave his stumbles. Family affection, when it is wise, does not demand perfection. I saw them together once in the street. Mr. Fred was talking animatedly about some trivial domestic subject, and Mr. Scrooge was listening with a patience that would have once stunned me. At the end of the conversation, my employer placed a hand briefly on his nephew's shoulder. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the sort of quiet touch that says, "I am here. I am trying." I turned away to give them privacy, and to hide the surprising emotion that rose in me. A year earlier, I would not have believed that I could feel tenderness on behalf of my employer. Yet here it was. The human heart is full of contradictions, especially when grace enters a place that once held only resentment. That evening, as we prepared for the next Christmas, my wife and I reviewed our modest plans. The difference now was that we discussed them with anticipation rather than anxiety. We could afford warmth without turning it into an exceptional event. We could buy a small gift for each child without pretending we were reckless aristocrats. Tiny Tim asked, in his earnest way, whether we should invite Mr. Scrooge to visit our home again during the season. My wife and I exchanged a glance. I said yes, because the story had reached the point where gratitude was not a debt. It was a friendship beginning to form. Mr. Scrooge arrived with a restraint that had softened into comfort. He sat among our children as though he were learning a new language of ordinary affection. The cat, who had never respected authority, investigated him with solemn suspicion before deciding he was not a threat to domestic peace. Mr. Scrooge accepted this judgment with surprising good humour. We ate, we laughed, we exchanged small remarks about the cold, the pudding, the strange persistence of winter, and for a moment the distance between employer and clerk dissolved into something more human. I do not mean that social realities vanished. He was still a wealthy businessman. I was still a working man. But something equal had begun to exist between us. A shared recognition that life is too short to waste on needless hardness. As the evening ended, I watched him stand by our door, looking out at the street with a softness that suggested he had finally learned the ordinary miracle of belonging somewhere beyond his own locked rooms. I knew then that the final part of this story would not be about how a miser became generous. It would be about how a man returned to the world he had once refused, and how the world, cautiously at first, learned to make room for him. I have learned that some endings do not arrive as thunder. They arrive as a quiet habit of peace. When another Christmas came round, the city had begun to treat Mr. Comcast Scrooge's transformation as a fact rather than a rumour, and my own family had begun to treat stability as something we were allowed to hold without flinching. The counting house was warmer now in every sense. The fire burned with honest coal. The ledgers were still strict because Mr. Scrooge never became careless, but the strictness had changed its purpose. It no longer served fear. It served stewardship. Mr. Fred remained a steady thread in his life. Their dinners became routine rather than exceptional, and that, I think, was part of the miracle. At home, my wife found new ways to be impatient about good news. She scolded me for leaving the door open too long, as if warmth were now a household rule rather than a fragile privilege. The children grew bold enough to ask for small luxuries without whispering. We still lived carefully, but careful no longer meant frightened. Tiny Tim continued to improve. His steps were never entirely free of caution, but his spirit had always been bolder than his body, and now his body began to follow. He took to helping in church not because he wished to be praised, but because he enjoyed the simple rhythm of belonging to a community that had once seemed too large for our small household to claim. Mr. Scrooge visited us with a quiet regularity. He did not overwhelm the children with gifts. Instead, he brought what mattered most to a family learning how to trust the future. He brought attention. He asked questions. He listened to answers that wandered joyfully off course. One evening, my youngest attempted to teach him a childish card game and insisted that the rules were flexible because Christmas was flexible. Mr. Scrooge played along with a solemnity that made the whole table laugh. My wife said that if he continued indulging such nonsense, the city would have to rename him Mr. Scrooge the Agreeable. He replied that he would accept the title only if it came with a formal certificate. We laughed, and I was reminded again that the healthiest homes are built as much from humour as from bread. But we still wonder whether a person becomes good because he fears the dark future, or because he finally admits that goodness is lighter to carry than cruelty. If his change had ended with one dramatic morning, I might have remained suspicious, but he kept at it. He asked after my family without making the questions performative. He treated my work with respect. He corrected my errors without old contempt. In time, the neighborhood stopped watching him like a curiosity and began to treat him like a man who had returned from a long absence. A baker offered him warmth in his greeting. A child spoke to him without fear. In our household, the practical effects mattered as much as the emotional ones. We saw doctors with less dread. We ate better. We warmed the rooms without turning heat into a moral debate. These were not luxuries. They were the foundations of dignity. As the season's festivities began again, my wife prepared pudding without the old anxious intensity. She even experimented with small improvements, as though the kitchen itself had been granted permission to imagine. When the pudding came out well, she declared that she might one day write a cookbook titled How to Survive Winter Without Hating Everyone. The children begged for the first copy. I told her I would provide the foreword, assuming I survived the editing. Our cat, now older and no less arrogant, attempted once again to steal a portion of meat. Tiny Tim shooed her away with the gentle authority of a child who believes even misbehaviour can be solved with kindness. Mr. Scrooge, watching this, remarked that the cat and he had once belonged to the same philosophical school. The room erupted in laughter, and he laughed too, unguarded. As night settled, I found myself watching the faces around our table. My wife, whose courage had always been the pillar of our home. My children, older by a year, still capable of invention and mischief. Tiny Tim, alive, present, bright with the kind of peace that makes a father quietly grateful for every ordinary morning. Mr. Scrooge sat among us with a humility that had become natural. He no longer behaved like a visitor seeking approval. He behaved like an elderly friend who had finally learned that belonging is not a reward for perfection. It is a practice of showing up. In that gentle hush between one laugh and the next, I thought of the alternate future the silent spirit had shown him. The indifference of businessmen, the stolen curtains, the lonely grave, the version of my house that might have been shaped by loss rather than resilience. The scenes were still painful to imagine, but the pain had changed its meaning. It was no longer a prophecy, it was a spared possibility. I looked at my employer and realized that his redemption was not a private miracle. It had become a shared one. The most important thing I can say, as a man who lived on the receiving end of his former hardness and now lives inside the radius of his kindness, is that transformation does not erase history. It dignifies it by proving the future can be different. I do not know how many more winters any of us are promised. I only know that this one was gentler than the last, and that gentleness was not an accident. So, if you ask what this story left behind in the world of one clerk and one old businessman, I would answer without ornament. It left us with a lesson practical enough to heat a room. The past may explain us, the present may test us, and the future may frighten us. But we are still allowed to choose what kind of people we will be when the door opens in the morning. And as I say good-night to you from this small, warmed corner of London, I ask you to carry that thought into your own season, whatever shape it takes. Because somewhere in every life there is a counting house of the heart, and somewhere in every heart there is still time to put more coal on the fire.